Welcome to today's CLC's keynote presentation of our Fall-Winter Speaker Series. My name is Beverly Bronte-Tinque. I'm a founding member of CLC and a member of the planning group for today's session. Concernedly Catholics is an independent group formed in Canada to affirm and live out the laity's role of co-responsibility in our church. Our vision, mission, and values flow from the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, the vision of the Holy Father, Pope Francis, and the call of the Canadian bishops for healing, reconciliation, and transformation. CLC exists to educate, engage, and empower Catholic lay people in Canada. In this particular time on the planet, healing, reconciliation, and transformation seem to be a calling for all of us. Dialogue and listening with open hearts, even in the presence of pain, was the basis of our group coming together, and this has proven to be a gift for each of us. We're hoping to share that with you. We invite you to explore our website, and if you like, sign up on our contact page. Then you'll receive our monthly newsletter, and be sure not to miss any of our exciting programs and presentations. The newsletter contains information about important events happening in our church, such as the recently announced synodal process. Tools and tips are available on our synodality page for how you can get involved in this important initiative in your own diocese. If you are interested in starting a CLC chapter, please let us know. Reach out. We'll be happy to have a chat. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us today on a lovely fall day. I'm sure you'll find the presentation illuminating, thought-provoking, and inspiring. We'd like to take this chance to pray together for the Synod. We stand before you, Holy Spirit, as we gather together in your name. With you alone to guide us, make yourself at home in our hearts. Teach us the way we must go and how we are to pursue it. We are weak and sinful. Do not let us promote disorder. Do not let ignorance lead us down the wrong path, nor partiality influence our actions. Let us find in you our unity, so that we may journey together to eternal life and not stray from the truth and what is right. All this we ask of you, who are at work in every place and time, in the communion of the Father and of the Son, forever and ever. Amen. Now I will turn it over to my fellow CLC Planning Group member, Joy Warner, to introduce today's guest speaker. Joy.
It is my great pleasure this afternoon to introduce our speaker, Michael Higgins. A native Torontonian, he is an author, scholar, Vatican Affairs specialist for the Globe and Mail, papal commentator for the CTV network, educator, columnist, and CBC radio documentarian. He has served as president and vice president of two Canadian Catholic universities, St. Jerome's in Waterloo and St. Thomas in Fredericton. He is currently principal and president, respectively, of St. Mark's College and Corpus Christi College, University of British Columbia. He has edited, co-authored, and authored scores of books, including The Catholic Church at the Crossroads, The Muted Voice, Religion and the Media, Suffer the Children Unto Me, an open inquiry into the clerical sex abuse scandal, and Impressively Free, Henry Nouwen as a model for the reformed priesthood. A columnist over the years for the Toronto Star, the Catholic Register, and the Irish Catholic, he is also a regular contributor to Commonweal and the Tablet. He is the recipient of many awards, including 2 honorary doctorates and the 2013 Gold Medal for International Radio Documentaries. He is a senior fellow at Massey College, University of Toronto. He is married to Christina, a liturgical musician and writer, and they have 4 adult children. As you can see, Michael is eminently qualified to speak to us this day, and we are very grateful to him for joining us. Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Joy. I hope everyone can hear me here. Welcome, everyone, to a Saturday afternoon session. The only time I ever remember taking a class or doing any work on a Saturday was when I was in the seminary. And it was a system, a curriculum, and structure modeled on the French seminary structure. Other than that, I don't ever recall gathering together for a talk or a lecture on a Saturday afternoon, except recently I gave one to the Newman Association on a Saturday morning. So I guess there's no day of the week that's now free of engagement. Maybe that's good. Anyway, what I want to talk to you about today is whatever happened to Canadian Catholicism. And it's a bit of a provocative topic, and I've been trying to figure out the best way of approaching this, given that I don't want to adopt a particularly magisterial approach, and also I'm very conscious of the fact one can come at this from a number of different points of view, right? Sociology of religion critique, theological or ecclesiological critique, a cultural critique, a political one. There are a number of different approaches one could take, given the nature of the topic. And so what I'm going to try and do is take largely an autobiographical approach, partly because of the informal nature of our engagement here, but also because I've been around long enough to have been born before the council and still be relatively cognizant and functioning today. So I've been around for a long period of time and seen so many changes in the Canadian Catholic Church that it seems to me that this is probably the right point of entry, right portal of entry, and then a light on particular significant events, and then which we can all see, and perhaps many of us will remember. And that, again, can be the way of entry for commentary, question and answer, whatever we have afterwards. Let me start off by saying, you know, that Concerned Lay Catholics is just one of many organizations that now flourish in the Roman Catholic communion. They're not new. In fact, they really began around the time of the Hans Groer crisis. Some of you may remember Hans Groer was a former Benedictine abbot who was the Archbishop of Vienna. And he was allegedly involved in several sex abuse incidents. Pope John Paul II, for reasons that are peculiar and probably known only by Pope John Paul II, he never removed him. And he remained in power in Vienna during a very difficult time, huge turbulence in the church, large hemorrhaging as Austrian Catholics felt greatly frustrated and left their church. Eventually, of course, he was removed. The evidence was overwhelming, and it became necessary that Cardinal Groer leave his position. During that time, Austrian Catholics, concerned lay Austrian Catholics, formed various groups to deal with the reconstitution, the reformation, the renewing of the Austrian Church following this appalling period. I remember talking to a very dear friend of mine, a Basilian priest in Toronto, French professor, and we were chatting one day, and he said, did I really think that these organizations were necessary? He wasn't without sympathy. He just thought that they arose out of an occasion of panic, maybe, and frustration, but that they would pass and that they were potentially schismatic. I said, I didn't think that was the case. And I said, my reading would be that we'll see more of these rather than fewer as time unfolds. Unfortunately, I've been confirmed in that rare act of prescience on my part. And now we have several organizations Many of them, in fact, I would say most of them, emerging out of the clerical sex abuse crisis. You see it in Ireland, and you see it in the United States, coming out of Washington, the Voice of the Faithful, many organizations coming together precisely because of the perception, quite legitimate one, that in leadership was missing on this crisis. This crisis cuts to the core of the gospel identity of the church. It's a defilement that we're all in various ways affected by, and that there seems to be general impotence in the machinery of the church to actually begin a correction. And so now, globally, we have several of like organizations because Catholics, lay Catholics, have become deeply alarmed by the inadequacies of the church leadership and its clergy to reform themselves. And so what you have in these organizations is not an act of rebellion. I have to tell you that the majority of Catholics who are frustrated by the church's handling of this have simply left. We have incredible evidence of the hemorrhaging. One German bishop recently commented on the supreme importance of holding the synods, precisely because of the fact that people are just not listening to the church at all. The Archbishop of Luxembourg, Jesuit, and the head of the Episcopal Conference in Europe said, look, we really have to follow the model of the German synodal process, because in Luxembourg, they don't even care anymore. They've just simply given up on the structure of the church and its failure to take control of itself, purging, if you like. So the existence of these organizations actually is a sign of hope. If I were a bishop or a prelate sitting in a dicastery in Rome, or in a nunciature, or in a diocesan office across the country, I would actually rejoice in the existence of organizations like this, precisely because they are a marker or a sign of the fact that people still care. They still care enough to want the church to reform these structures, and therefore a marker of hope. I think Pope Francis and many bishops actually do see it that way. Maybe not quite the majority, but sufficient to provide encouragement for lay Catholics who are engaged in this, because actually this isn't just a story about empowering the lay people. It's a story about the necessity of empowering the lay people for the long-term survival of the church as we understand it. I want to start off, it's a bit lengthy, but I wanted to start off because it is a wonderful encapsulation of precisely the kind of thing that Concerned Lay Catholics is about, and indeed what my talk is about today. It is the leader, which is the first editorial in a publication, although in this particular case, it is the only editorial in this occasion because it takes up the entire page of the Tablet of London. And it is from 16th of October, so it's fairly recent, just last week. And it's called The Synodal Process, a Kairos Moment. I want to read from this because it sets the backdrop, or sets the proper tone of what we're going to explore over the next short time. The slogan, "If it isn't hurting, it isn't working," would be a good one to adopt for the process of church renewal launched by Pope Francis last week. It is time the Catholic Church faced some uncomfortable truths about itself and rid itself of some familiar illusions. The honest global conversation which Pope Francis has called for in the name of synodality is likely to be a painful one. Indeed, that could be the test of its success. The questions for this conversation to address could be posed in a number of ways, starting with what went wrong. The Second Vatican Council, which ended in 1965, heralded a new era, which it was hoped would by now be bearing much fruit. A renewed Catholic Church would be a faithful symbol of the gospel in everything it said and in everything that it did. Instead, the good name of the Catholic Church has been undermined. And in country after country, from Europe to the Americas, the sexual abuse of children by members of the clergy and the cynical attempts by their superiors to protect abusers from prosecution has brought shame upon it. Tremendous good has been done in the name of the gospel, but it has been drowned out by the vast ocean of wickedness, with tens of thousands of young lives permanently damaged. Now, Vatican II did many, many good things, but it did not bring about the end of the cult of clericalism, of priests being above the law and beyond suspicion. And clericalism, it is almost universally accepted, is the ideology which made clerical child abuse possible and shouted its perpetrators. And the most clerical of the clericalists tended to be bishops. The First Vatican Council, which ended hurriedly in 1870, strengthened the position of the Pope vis-a-vis the bishops. The second one sought to rebalance that relationship in the other direction, but left bishops arguably with too much power vis-a-vis their clergy, and the clergy with too much power vis-a-vis the laity. It is common, and this is the concluding sentence and a powerful one, it is common for reform to correct imbalances in one respect to have unforeseen consequences in others. But every church reform eventually needs another reform. Hence the Latin phrase, Ecclesia semper reformanda, the church ever reforming. And that's what we're doing. We're being part of an exercise or a process of reformation, not because it is unique or peculiar to us, but because in an important way, it has been a feature of Catholic life for 2 millennia. But that's something we often forget, isn't it? We often forget that the church's capacity for reformation is considerable, hence the power of grace in the life of the church. In addition to its pathologies, of course, are its spiritual resources, that exquisite balance that allows us to realize that the church is more than its structures, more than its authority figures, more than its broken and wounded members, which includes all of us, of course. But the important thing to remember is that the interest in the laity as agents of reform is a relatively recent phenomenon. Now, it's not that there weren't reformers who were lay in the past. There were, but their number was small. Think of Thomas More, for instance, in England. But the majority of the reformers were clerics, because the majority of those educated in the sacred disciplines were clerics. And in fact, in many instances, the only ones who were educated were clerics or clerks. So obviously, that would be the dominant reality. That is no longer the case. In fact, it shifted profoundly during our lifetime. But it was John Henry Newman, in some very interesting work in the 19th century, that provides the groundwork for where we are now. And I'm going to quote, this is my one and only instance of shameless self-promotion. I'm shameless on several fronts, but the self-promotion here, I'm quoting from my own book called The Church Needs the Laity. I'm going to quote 2 sections here because I think they're important. Richard Simpson, who was a convert from Anglicanism to Catholicism, was an active Roman Catholic layperson in the 1850s, and he was editor of a magazine called The Rambler. The bishops weren't as keen on his vocal expression of opinion, if you like, and so eventually they got rid of him. And they put Cardinal Newman as the editor. Newman had difficulties as well, and eventually the magazine closed down. But what is interesting is something that Simpson said in the 1850s, which is as true now as it was then. He writes a letter initially intended for publication in a French publication, Le Correspondant, a review published by the French Catholic intellectual Charles Forbes René de Montalembert. And he's annoyed at what has recently happened in England over a school commission report. Here's what Simpson says. Jealousy of the laity is a natural result of the strictness of the administrative organization, which is now considered to constitute the strength of the clergy. The compactness of the clerical union makes it a caste. It has a separate professional education, and it has separate habits of thought. The laity are to be kept in ignorance of all religious questions except those in the catechism, in order to misuse their obedience to a body of directors professionally educated to manage their religion for them. Religion is turned into administration, the clergy into theological police, and the body of thinking laymen and laywomen into a mass of suspects, supposed to be brooding on nothing but revolution, and only kept together by motives of fear and by the external pressure of a clerical organization. End of quote. Now, Simpson's tirade is more than justified, and Newman shared his deep disappointment with an ecclesiastical system that devalued the laity. But Newman moved more cautiously in his efforts to secure a future for the Rambler, that is, until it became necessary to directly confront hierarchical intransigence, to directly confront the disparagement of the laity that was the gruel that kept clerical entitlement sated. Newman's bishop once asked him, "Who are the laity?" And Newman responded something to the effect that the church would look foolish without them. Bishop Ullathorne's query was more puzzled and benign compared to Monsignor Talbot's rather pointed and malign question. What is the province of the laity? Their job is to hunt, to shoot, to entertain. These matters they understand, but to meddle with ecclesiastical matters, they have no right at all. Well, given that I don't hunt and shoot, I have only one quality and responsibility left, and that is to entertain. And part of that is to entertain you for the next 40 minutes or so. Monsignor Talbot's outrageous expression bore the signs of authenticity or truth in Victorian views of the laity. Sad to say, those views aren't limited to the Victorian period. Queen Victoria died in 1901, but Victorian sentiment, theological or otherwise, has survived long after her. There are many clergy, far fewer today than in the past, of course, who would hold a similar view. The laity, they are there to be instructed, to be informed, to be led, to be looked after. Solicitude for the salvation of the laity is often an overriding concern of the clergy. And one of the reasons why there was a great apprehension around the reputation of the church being sundered or besmirched by the clerical sex abuse crisis. Let's keep this dark secret hidden. Why? Because the laity will be scandalized. And when they're scandalized, you don't know what's going to happen to them. But of course, it was the long history of suppressing knowledge that has contributed to the massive scandal of the laity. The laity are not easily scandalized outside of what the church does to itself. It seems to me then, as we begin to reflect upon this, I want to look at it, keeping in mind what Simpson and Newman have said, keeping in mind the tablet leader that I quoted from. Let me now move specifically to what has happened in Canada in the last number of years. Now, I'm not going to go back to the beginning of time or to my own birth date, 1948. I'm just going to go back to the time of the council and bring us up to here. What has happened to Canadian Catholicism and what is its future? Well, in the 1950s, just before the council, I was a student at St. Thomas Aquinas School in Toronto. And what I recall from that period is a period of very careful, beautifully delineated ghettoization of the Catholic community. Toronto, as some of you may know, was an orange city at the time. Orange men dominated in the corridors of power. Catholics were considered not a lesser species, but still some of the late 19th century, early 20th century doubts about the loyalty or the fidelity of Catholics was still out there. There wasn't a huge anti-papistry movement, but there were many people who held residually strong anxieties about what Catholics were really about. And of course, we contributed to feeding this precisely because we existed primarily as a ghetto. So, I mean, it wasn't until I got to high school, Bond Road Collegiate Institute, that I discovered, in fact, that there were people who weren't Catholic, and given the nature of the school I was in and where it was situated in Toronto, with somewhere like 80 to 85% of the student body being Jewish, and many of them children of recent immigrants following the Holocaust, I entered an entirely different world from the world that I was known, a world shaped by the Sisters of Loretto, shaped by a parish that had 5 priests. Can you imagine that? 5 priests running the parish, and a whole Catholic world that existed within the larger world, right? The Second Vatican Council very much changed that, of course, and a contributing factor for the change for me, personally speaking, was my entering the Scarborough Foreign Mission Fathers in their seminary in 1966, which is the year immediately after the council. This was an interesting and an important experience in my life. I am not one that harbors resentment toward my seminary training. I loved the time I had in the seminary. I was never the subject of clerical predators. I wasn't ravished in the middle of the night. I didn't have people propositioning me. I enjoyed a life of commendable security, routine. I learned all kinds of things in the seminary I never learned before. I learned how to swear in the seminary. I learned how to drink in the seminary. I learned in some respects how to be human, how to laugh in the seminary. And many of the seminarians who were with me, some who became priests, some who are no longer functioning in priestly ministry, and some who left but remain closely attached to the church, has lasted to this day. I've attended their weddings, they've attended mine. We've become friends, we remain friends. We were shaped by the seminary. And the seminary in the immediate post-Vatican II period was a remarkably liberal institution, in sharp contrast to the realities today. It was a place where there was great ferment of thought. Priests and theologians teaching us. We're just coming back from Germany and coming back from France, coming back from the continental universities, full of the new ideas of the council and keen on imparting those ideas and the fervor of the council to their young seminarian charges. I remember in 1967, there was a great congress in Toronto called the Congress on the Theology of the Renewal of the Church, or Theological 67. It was designed to coincide, of course, with our centennial. And they brought all these eminent council fathers and their periti to the University of Toronto, took over the entire St. George campus. And I was a seminarian at the time, I think it was 18 or something. And they sent me as a squirrel running around carrying papers for Edward Skillebecks and helping set up a table for Father Kung and dealing with all these eminent periti. I had no idea the world that I entered in, but I wasn't attending it as a student. Of course, I was just a seminarian. I was a gopher, just moving things around. But it gave me an opportunity to meet many of the great names, the Illuminati of the council, many of them, of course, who have shaped the Catholic sensibility ever since. But that enthusiasm and excitement generated by the council and continued 2 years later by the Council of the Theology for the Renewal of the Church, and Canada was chosen as the place where that Congress occurred. Again, a startling reminder of the role of the Canadian Catholic Church at the time. Was in no small part deeply unsettled by the publication in 1968 of Pope Paul VI's encyclical on artificial birth regulation called Humanae Vitae. The publication of that document was a major life changer and institution shatterer, if you like, for the comfortable Catholicism that in many respects had existed prior to then, even though we had had those years of the council. Without rehearsing all the arguments, and many of you will be familiar with this, the existence of the Majority Commission and the Minority Commission, the reason why Pope Paul VI opted to go with the minority position rather than the majority position, the enormous reaction around the world, some Episcopal conferences being more Roman than Rome, trying to show their fidelity to the Holy Father in a rather slavish manner. Other institutions, other churches, particularly the Canadian, trying to find a middle ground and recognizing the primacy of conscience, but not discounting the importance of this document issuing from the Roman Magisterium. So there was there was great debate and great upheaval, and it is arguable, in fact, I think it is, to be truthful, inarguable, that the crisis of authority in papal authority that we often witness even now commenced with the Humani Vitae document. It's when large numbers of Catholics, clerics, and otherwise began to have serious doubts about the wisdom on the Tiber. Why was no one listening? What were they listening to? Why were they imposing a basically rigid neo-scholastic and biologistic reading on the debate, rather than looking at it from a much more motivariegated manner, as was the case with the majority commission that was put in place by the Pope himself? So anyway, the debates around this are enormous, and they continue to this day. What is not arguable is that it really shook the foundations of univocal, clear, fully accepted, and categorical papal authority. It's never going to be the same again. So throughout the 1970s, however, in spite of the shock waves emanating from the 1968 release of Humani Vitae, were remarkable. The founding of the Toronto School of Theology in early 1970, the fact that in the late 1960s, women received graduate degrees in theology. Two of them were Catholic at the time. The emergence of a remarkably rich and wide and inclusive theological consortium at the University of Toronto, the Toronto School of Theology, of course. But within that Catholic framework, you had the Institute for Christian Studies, you had the University of St. Michael's Colleges and St. Basil's Seminary own theological programs in addition to their direct federation with the TST, and they were major players. You had all of the denominational colleges, the Feds and some of the affiliates of the University of Toronto, all part of this. You had hundreds and hundreds of theology students. Many religious orders had their centers for formation and training, either directly on the campus or within the immediate vicinity. And it was a flourishing period for both Master Divinity students, the old STB, meaning those in training for Ministerial Priesthood, as well as the emergence of lay Catholics taking theology courses parallel with the ministry training program on the campus, exposed to the larger ecumenicity. An extraordinary time of ferment growth with many of the finest theological minds in Canada, nay, I would argue, in North America, actually resident on that campus. That was through the 1970s. And part of the 1980s, but then things began to change. It began to change most radically, I think, with the accession of John Paul II in 1978. This is the year of the three popes, as Peter Heathcliff once wrote in a marvelous book on the three popes, Paul VI, John Paul I, of course, Albino Luciani, and then Caro Wojtyła, John Paul II. And although the election of John Paul II was received with a universal surprise, but also with great hope by the Catholic world, the tenor and the direction under this very long pontificate might lead one to conclude otherwise. Certainly, John Paul II's papacy was distinguished by many high points. He's taking the Pope very clearly out of Rome to travel the globe and to be present. The high level theatricality, the importance of establishing Peter in places outside of Rome as not just a symbol, but a working presence, achieved extraordinary heights not to be equaled. Although the attendance at one of the World Youth Days under Francis exceeded all numbers, but that's a different matter. So John Paul II's tenure as pontiff had many high points, as I say, from a political point of view, from a social cultural point of view. One should never forget that more than any pope prior to him, he had the interests and the concerns of the Aboriginal peoples of the world at heart, and would often specifically address them, whether they were the Guatemalan natives struggling against their government or other jurisdictions across the planet. His social justice doctrine, and it really was a doctrine, encapsulated in three critical works of startling innovation and insight, are marks of the success, I think, in some respects, of this pontificate. But one of the great drawdowns, if you like, or negative aftershocks of the papacy was its his profound apprehension around independent thinkers in leadership. This is surprising given his own education as an intellectual at the Agilonian, given his multifaceted intellectual skills as a dramatist, as a playwright, as a poet, as a philosopher. One would have thought that it would have been natural to him to encourage independent thinking. But one has to consider his own ecclesio-political experience and realize to some degree factors that contributed to his seeing that with some dread. And so you had, under his leadership for so many years, you had appointments at middle level management, senior level too, for that matter, with one exception, that were largely appointed or promoted, if you will, for their compliance, for their managerial ability, for their reliability, for their canonical rigidity, if you like. They weren't appointed because they were the bright lights in the room. They weren't appointed because they were stellar leaders. They certainly weren't appointed because they were temerarious thinkers. All those qualities were seen, I think, by Pope John Paul II as not contributing to what he perceived as the essential righting of the church during a time of turmoil, and of course always facing the dread specter, first of communism and then of consumerism. So with those larger ideological fights being undertaken, and seeing himself as the principal warrior in that regard, what he needed was backup troops. He didn't need independent commanders. And so for a long period of time, the Roman Catholic Church has dealt with an episcopacy that was in many ways dutiful and managerial, and by no means visionary or independent. There are always exceptions to this. These are simply generalizations, and for every generalized remark, you can find exceptions. I understand that. But there was a closing down during this period. And there were various people in Canada during this time that were affected by this. Gregory Baum, one of the leading theologians, Peritus of the Council, Archbishop Hayes, the Archbishop of Halifax, and a liturgist. And to some degree, even Wojtyła's close friend, Gerald Emmett, Cardinal Carter. Cardinal Carter had huge difficulties with various things that were coming out of the Wojtyła papacy, though he remained always the company man. Privately, in his correspondence, in interviews, he made it quite clear that he found the failure to take the Synod on the Family as a genuine synod to be more flexible, to be more open to the world. Not in the sense of being polluted by the world, but of being dialogue with the world. These channels were being closed down, and that the Pauline papacy, that of Paul VI, was preferable in this regard. But again, a loyal son of the church, he kept many of these criticisms to himself. And when he stepped down and was succeeded by Archbishop Ambrosic, later to be Cardinal Ambrosic, who had a slightly different tenor. Though you had in Cardinal Ambrosic, although we had in Cardinal Ambrosic, a remarkable intellectual, one of the better intellectual products of this country, by the way. But during this time as well, in other words, from the 80s through the 90s and into our own period, you see the begin of the decline of the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops on both the national and the international front. Many of their offices were closed down. You've also had a growing tepidity in their synod interventions. You went from temerity to tepidity. Dr. Doug Letson and I covered many of the synods in the 80s for Grail, an ecumenical journal, but also for our own work. And we delivered on this at the international conferences, talking about the interventions of the Canadian bishops at the time. And over a period of time, particularly through the 1980s, if you look carefully at the interventions, by the way, being those speeches made by the bishop delegates who were synod fathers at these particular ordinary and sometimes extraordinary synods that were held in Rome, you discover a remarkable theological forthrightness, particularly in regard to the role of women in ministry. It's remarkable. It's also remarkable that it got absolutely no traction in Rome. Well, it's remarkable in that sense that it got no traction, but it's not remarkable in the sense that it could not have been anticipated. These were topics that were not going to be proceeded with or to entertain seriously. The synods themselves were closed events. I can tell you that from having been there. I was not a participant directly, of course, because I'm not a synod father, but every now and then they would allow journalists who were credentialed, auditores and others to come in to sit in for a particular session in the presence of the Pope to get a sense of the dynamic of what's going on. Well, there was no dynamic. There were just a series of small speeches or interventions given to a largely inattentive series of prelates sitting in front of the room because they knew the foregone conclusions. And people used to quip, including bishops, delegates, that the concluding document of the synods were already written in advance. I have no doubt, in a couple of instances at least, that was true. That's all changed, by the way, but this was what it was like in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. Increasingly, the Conference of Catholic Bishops in Canada withdrew from the social political arena. You will remember the various documents that appeared in the late 70s and early 1980s that dealt with issues around labor justice and other matters as well. There was a special office for this. The Canadian media were interested in what bishops said. There was an electricity that has long since gone out. There was a constricting, if you like, of the Catholic vision, the absence of the Catholic voices in the public forum, and a withdrawal. And I look at on this with tremendous sadness, by the way. You've seen over the last number of decades the turning in of our church on the national scene. We were a vibrant church. We had outspoken individuals. Of course, we had divisions. We had factions. You always have divisions and factions. One should never be surprised by that. There's always pockets of partisanship or whatever language we use. We've always had that. There's never been a univocal, completely integrated, one voice operation. The history of the church is a perfect instance of gainsaying all of that. But the quieting of voices of dissent were seemingly minor compared to the fact that people just aren't interested anymore, or the media is not interested anymore. The absence of the church's presence on the national scene, with the exception of periodic visits, usually around life reproductive issues, that it is largely a no-go area. And this seems to me really to forfeit an important function of leadership, and that is the prophetic, not just the maintenance of the structures, their conservation, the charism of preservation, which I think is very important. But bishops also should, on at least occasion, exercise the charism of prophecy, or allow those who have those charisms a proper platform for expression or influence. This withdrawal into a tribal church, into a church which has become increasingly more like a sect than a national presence, is deleterious, not just to the Catholic Church, but to the larger community. Catholicism is a major component of the mosaic of what it means to be Canadian. And our withdrawal, sometimes very clearly self-withdrawal, has contributed to the fact that we are less and less on the radar screen. And when we are on the radar screen, it's always because of scandal. It's always because of friction and division, rather than other dimensions of Christian life, Catholic joy, the genius that has also been an important part of shaping who we are, and those voices that were so essential. Coincidental and not unrelated is the precipitate and irreversible decline of the Catholic presence in the media, as well as the serious decline of Catholic publication and media initiatives. Compass, Grail, the Canadian Catholic Review, once known as the Chelsea Journal, Catholic New Times, Prairie Messenger, Western Catholic Reporter, Catholic Times of Montreal, they've all disappeared. They've all disappeared. Again, there are other instances in other jurisdictions in the United States and in England where some have disappeared or been merged or have been prey to the madness and volatility of the market. But the decline in terms of organs of dissemination and enlightened commentary and in-house Catholic reflection in other jurisdictions, it's not comparable to Canada. We lead the world in the decline of our public voice, not just in terms of the fact that in many media outlets, secular media outlets, no longer is there an overriding interest or any interest at all in Catholic content, but in religion, period. The marginalization of religion in this country is a source of deep concern that far exceeds Catholic consideration. Religion editors and religion correspondents have virtually disappeared. The only full-time religion reporter in the country now is in the Winnipeg Press, Winnipeg Free Press. Doug Todd of the Vancouver Sun, who does an excellent job as religion reporter. He now is responsible for migration and several other issues. It's a composite role. He does an excellent job, but the Vancouver Sun does provide religion coverage. But in most newspapers in the country, it's a disappearing act. And similarly in the media, with rare exceptions. CBC's Tapestry, Second Regard in Radio-Canada, a couple of exceptions. And of course, with Salt and Light Media, Tom Wasika's initiative of several years ago, which is still around, a little conservative, I think, but an important voice to be heard, important work done, is in and of itself an exception. There are very few things going on. And this is this is alarming. And lay people have a responsibility for this. It's not just saying, oh, wow, the bishops closed them down. The bishops didn't close them down. All right. So there are ways in which it seems to me we are all participants in the decline. And it would be a mistake to scapegoat the episcopate and say, well, all of this is as a result of the episcopate. No, it's not. There are other forces that are at work as well. Increased secularization, diminished public witness, the failure of lay Catholics to take significant leadership roles, the failure of Canadian Catholics to self-identify as Catholic in the public forum, as if somehow other that's going to be a delimiting or degrading component of their witness. So we have lots of these things going on. Catholic theology schools and universities in some important ways have moved from being constitutively Catholic to residually Catholic, by which I mean the following. Even in the 1960s, there was still a strong presence of independent Catholic universities across the country. By the late 1960s, you have Assumption University becoming the University of Windsor. You have St. Dunstan University joining Prince of Wales to become the University of Prince Edward Island. And over a very short period, well, over 2 decades, hitherto very strong Catholic universities with very clear missions. St. Francis Xavier University in Antigonish, the university I was president of for a while, St. Thomas University in Fredericton, New Brunswick, experienced quite significant mission drift. And St. Vincent University and St. Mary University in Halifax, similarly so. Some of them are now completely secularized and outside of the Association of Catholic Universities and Colleges of Canada. Others maintain membership, but their reputation as Catholic is entirely historical and nominal. Now, there are all kinds of reasons for this. And very rarely is it somebody coming along saying, oh, look, we really have to go in this direction if we're going to survive, and it's unhealthy to be Catholic, and what we really need is to be forcefully competitive, and we need to be completely, as much as we can be, similar to our peers or competitors in order to make a real success, if you like, with the market. And so extra theological considerations come into place. And as a consequence, concern around the motivating principles, the historical values, people hired for leadership rather than just simply for management, disconnection from the Catholic intellectual tradition and what it means. Eventually, all these come together to produce a situation where the leadership in many institutions is not what it should be and not what it can be. This doesn't mean that there isn't great work done in these institutions. It means that they are not in the same place they were before. And for some historians and commentators, this is all to the good. The more secular and the more indistinguishable various Catholic institutions, whether the universities, schools, hospitals, or whatever, are from their secular counterpart, the better. The deeper argument, however, and the logical one, is that the more indistinguishable we are, why are we around at all? What is unique to our mission? Why do we have a place in the Canadian mosaic that shouldn't be diluted, but should be strengthened? And why that's a contributing factor to multiculturalism, to the multi-faith dimension of Canada, and not a detracting element. To be Catholic is not to be indifferent, intolerant, cultish, somehow or other removed from secular concern, but in the best tradition of Catholicism, which is a ministry looking out and being inclusive. You see it in our hospitals, and you see it in our schools, and you see it in our universities, when we adhere precisely to those values that shape us. And they have to be constitutive. They can't be residual. And I think in many cases, what we have seen is the latter. Catholic hospitals and Catholic schools have their own respective struggles with public sympathy and admiration. And we see this most particularly in struggles over many of the ethical issues that put these institutions on a collision course with their primary funding bodies. And then, of course, we have the branding crisis, the sex abuse issue and its lingering aftershocks, and the real breakdown of Episcopal leadership in this regard. Should we have seen this coming? Should we have been prepared for it? Well, it's rather foolish in a way to be asking these questions now, since we are now facing the reality of the revelations or the shocks or disclosures. Certainly, we see the beginnings of this with Mount Cashel. You may remember the Mount Cashel crisis of the 1980s. The Irish Christian Brothers School for young boys that was run in the Archdiocese of St. John's. Concurrent with that crisis were instances of clerical sex abuse in the Archdiocese of St. John's itself. And so within a short period of time, Archbishop Alphonsus Penny commissioned two reports, the Winter Report and the Hayes Report, one dealing very specifically with the clergy and one dealing with the Christian Brothers and the school. It is arguable whether the Catholic Church could have recovered from the instances in Newfoundland if it had been confined to Newfoundland. It is inarguable that it was not confined to Newfoundland. Kirches have erupted all across the country, perhaps most egregiously and most dramatically in the Diocese of Antigonish, and very ironically, because Antigonish was the priest breeder of the country. More priests were coming out of that diocese than any other single diocese in at least English-speaking Canada. And suddenly we had this huge problem that almost bankrupted the diocese, the selling off of parishes and having to deal with the aftershocks. And then, of course, compounding this was the conviction of Bishop Raymond Leahy, a much admired bishop in so many regards, and a scholar bishop, because of his maintaining a profile of pedophile photos on a return from Thailand. We know the story that ends very sadly with his jailing, although he's now out of jail. The jailing of a bishop who died in jail for the raping of Native women in British Columbia. The number of clergy that were alleged to have been involved in sex abuse, Canadian clergy, ranging all the way from minor Vatican officials to individuals in chanceries, to parish life, to religious orders, has peppered the country. And we've dealt with it, and the bishops dealt with it. In the early 1990s, they issued various documents as they tried to contain the damage, as they tried to address the damage. Various analyses were done, various reports and investigations, as I've indicated. And as a previous speaker, Nuala Kenny, who herself a pediatrician and ethicist herself, has written extensively about this. There have been conferences held, including one I had the privilege to participate in at Concordia University, or the University of Montreal, several years ago, and then wrote with my friend, the now deceased lawyer and producer, Peter Kavanagh, in Suffer the Children Unto Me. But in many ways, we haven't actually addressed the issue. We may have stanched the flow, we may have dealt with some of the immediate consequences, we may have responded to the cries for treatment for the errant clergy, whether rehabilitation or incarceration, or certainly suspension, and indeed, for many now, laicization. But the root causes still in many ways exist, and we're still wrestling with them. We can see that in part with the release of the recent report, the Jean-Marc Sauvé report coming out of France, with astonishing numbers that has shocked the Catholic world. And the realization that they haven't eliminated things, and that in some particular instances, there is evidence of a rise of incidents again after having plateaued. Well, quite independent of the statistics, whether the blip or how they're interpreted by various authorities, the fact remains we still have a problem. And although the popes, several popes, have talked about the curse of clericalism, and Pope Francis has, Pope John Paul II did, Bishop de Smet, in one of the opening addresses, the opening address of the first session of the Second Vatican Council, talked about the curse of clericalism. So clericalism has been around for a long time. It's not unique. Pope Benedict XVI talked about getting rid of the rot within the clergy. So it's not that we're unaware of this now. I mean, it's in our face, right? But the more radical surgery that's called for, we still seem reluctant to employ. We still seem to somehow think that if we can put some corrective measures in place, we can prevent these kinds of things from ever happening again. I think we are yet to look at the root causes of the clericalism that pedophilia, clerical pedophilia has revealed. Just one, and particularly egregiously nasty dimension of that. But I want to conclude these reflections by saying that not all is dark, of course. There are remarkable pockets of light. The emergence increasingly of a committed laity, of which this organization is just one of many. The creative forays of publishing house Novalis Bayard and the several books that they have brought out around the laity and around neuralgic and difficult issues that make people feel uncomfortable. They've taken some bold initiatives that in an earlier time they would not have, and they should be applauded for it. The continued powerful witness, particularly of women religious, and their abiding fidelity in a time of great upheaval. And we also have a Pope who is forcing us to look truth in the face. This was his response to the French bishops at their ad limina meeting with him just prior to the release of the Sauvé report. What should we do, Holy Father, they said. And he remarked, look truth in the face. Well, it seems to me that we actually don't have any alternative. We are called to look truth in the face. And the face of the Catholic Church in Canada has changed significantly over the last number of years since the Second Vatican Council. It's not but without its bright points, its high points, its richness, its witness, its genius for renewal. But it's also been a very dark time, a time in which there has been institutional dysfunction, and it's on show for everyone to see, a time of serious hemorrhaging of the young, the slow, methodical, but in end almost irreversible disappearance of religious issues and the religious sensibility from the public forum. I was thinking of this just in the context recently of the death of Sir David Amos. Sir David, you would have read about, was a British politician who was stabbed to death in his constituency. Not his office, but meeting constituents at a Methodist church in Southwark, London, or just outside London. And The British press have written greatly about this, of course, and it's been covered in detail. And outside of the Catholic world, in the larger world at large, they talked about Sir David's Catholic faith. The richness, the depth of his Catholic faith. One of the things that motivated him to meet with his constituents, to listen to them, to help with issues around homelessness, to build relations with the local churches, but also with the larger religious community, to realize the importance of that witness in political, concrete terms, bringing gifts, listening, being attentive. His Catholicism wasn't a decorative element. It wasn't a cultural hangover. It was at the heart of what he did, of his political life, of his political vocation. Again, although the circumstances are sad one, admittedly, again, a wonderful example of how the British press handles religion in the political vein. Now I know there's the great excitement about Boris Johnson's reattaching to his Catholic roots, being married in Westminster Cathedral, and prior to that, having his child baptized. Now, Boris is a complicated creature, and this says something about the flexibility of our canonical tradition, irrespective of all those, however. The fact is, faith matters. It matters with Tony Blair. The deep Protestant faith of Gordon Brown was important. Theresa May's Anglican faith, these all came up for discussion and reflection. In Canada, and we are unique in this, in the English-speaking world, to alight on the discussion, acknowledgement, recognition of the value and importance of religion in the life of a political leader is verboten. You'd be hard-pressed to get anyone even to say, oh, by the way, I'm a Catholic, or this comes from the tradition that shaped me, or I learned this in my Catholic college, or whatever. We have completely removed religion from the public forum, and I think this is deplorable. There are examples where you don't want religion in the political forum. We have excellent examples of the success of enthusiasm in the United States, which protests regularly about its separation of church and state and is more Erastian than many European churches. But in Canada, we don't have the balance right. And the United States, they may well wrestle with Joe Biden's Catholicism. They write books about Joe Biden's Catholicism. They try to understand the roots of his social conscience. Flawed and inconsistent on occasion that it may be, it matters to him, it shapes the man. We don't have any books on Justin Trudeau's Catholicism yet, maybe because it's a difficult book to write, but having been involved in co-authoring a book on Pierre Elliott Trudeau's Catholicism, one kind of wishes for a time, the return of a time, when the discussion of a political leader's religious faith was seen as an important determinative, not the most important, not the only, but an important element in the life of a political leader. I mean, we know a great deal about their sexual orientation, about their taste in food, about where they like to travel and everything else, mostly material that perhaps we don't need to know, but their religious convictions, which can shape how they are, how they can respond, the sensibility that in many ways defines their life of service, that we keep completely on the outside. So that's a contributing factor to the problem of Catholic witness that doesn't originate with Catholicism. It's part of the direction of our society, but as the largest religious denomination in the country, it seems to me that we could exercise some leadership in this matter that could help to redress this. We don't have to go the route of some countries where religion is too dominant in the national discourse. We don't have to go to a point where it's not present at all. And there was a time in which Catholic leadership, and there are Catholic leaders in various important positions, in universities, in corporate life, in the media, in government. There's no reason why they should be in the closet. Everything else is out of the closet, religion's in the closet. It doesn't seem to make any sense to me. And the historical, cultural reasons for that need careful scrutiny and examination, something that I hope to do at some point in my retirement. So let me say this by the end. Whatever happened to Canadian Catholicism? Well, we're it. Canadian Catholicism is all of us. Those baptized in the church, those who have come into the church, those who are on the periphery of the church, and we know that Pope Francis is fond of peripheries, though he means it geographically and culturally. One can also make the sense that it could mean religiously. Many Catholics are trying to discern whether they have any affection for the church of their youth, the church of their birth. We have a responsibility of reminding them that they're co-participants in a resurrection of joy and hope. And the existence of organizations like this is not because this is a platform or an arena for therapy in a time of ecclesial dissolution or anger generating reality, but an opportunity for healing, for joy, for listening, and for doing what Pope Francis has said we should do when he spoke to the French bishops, that could be just as easily said to any Catholic in the world. We look truth in the face. And when we do that, that means, particularly as we go into the synodal process, particularly as we move towards the culmination in 2023, which many now consider will not be the culmination, but in fact, the next stage of an ongoing reform, which is, I think, most welcome and most likely to be true. We, as a small church in the global church, but not insignificant in our influence, can play a vital role of recovering our own charism in our church in the country, but also participating in Ecclesia Semper Reformata, beginning to realize and bring to fruition the genius and insights of the Second Vatican Council. I think those are important things to think about. Thank you.
Fantastic.
All right.
Thank you.
So this concludes the speech portion of our talk. However, we will be opening the floor to questions, and so in order to facilitate that, there's a couple of ways we can do it. If you're within the Zoom app, there's a section called reactions, and within reactions, you can raise your hand. If you would like to ask a question, you can utilize that. Or if you'd like to just send a message to me in the chat. So all the chat commentary, chat function is directed to the event moderator or myself right now. So if you have a question, you can direct it to me. And if you'd like to ask the question directly, we can open your microphone, and Mike will be happy to take your questions. So if you have questions, please indicate so now. Okay, we've got
Deirdre out there.
Yeah. All right. So Deirdre, and the other thing I'd just like to remind everyone right now that this session is being recorded. If you wish to be seen on video, and the video will be archived. If you wish to be seen on video, then you're welcome to share your camera. If you'd prefer not to, then definitely don't feel like you have to. And at this point, I just invite Deirdre to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Great, thanks. Thanks very much for that, Dr. Higgins. That was, I just love listening to you because you're so knowledgeable, and it just reminds me again of the bigger picture and so on. Anyway, I was just thinking about one of the points that you were making there near the end about that we don't know the religion of our leaders anymore. I think about Andrew Scheer, who was known to be Catholic, and not in a way that I was proud about. And then I heard a lot of people in the talking about Trudeau being Catholic when he said he was embarrassed as a Catholic, and I heard some criticism about whether or not that was, like, is he a Catholic? Like, what kind of Catholic? Is it okay to be a marginalized Catholic? Is he on the edge? Is he who else? Oh yeah, Annemie Paul is Jewish, and then of course, Jagmeet Singh and so on. Like, I think it is interesting that as you say that, like, I'm agreeing with you, and then I'm like, but in my contrarian head, I'm like, wait a minute, I happen to know all of this about all these people. Kathleen Wynne made it clear she was, like in the United Church, people were really proud that she had some kind of faith there. So anyway, I just wondered, anyway, it's good to see you again. We were on a panel together about a film called Fall, about a priest.
Yes, indeed, I do remember that, by Terence Odette, right?
That's right. He lives just down the street from where our church is. Well, no, he lives downtown Hamilton. Anyway, that was it. And it's good to see you. And thank you very much. I just wondered what you thought about, like, there is a little bit of transparency about people's religion, and they use it in different ways, I think. Yeah.
Well, I think that's a very good point, actually, Deirdre. David Lametti, who is the Justice Minister, right? He came out and said, as a practicing Catholic, which I noticed Justin did not say. He said as a Catholic, but he came out and said, as a practicing Catholic, I'm appalled by the leadership of the Church in Canada over the issue of releasing all the documents for the residential schools and solving the issue around payment and whatnot. Now, that self-disclosure, again, is a wonderful thing to see, but what was arresting about it was it's so unusual. And it comes out of a context of crisis, right? Out of a collision rather than out of some other kind of motivating factor. I think that there are undoubtedly Catholics or United Church ministers, of course, who have served and continue to serve in public life, right? And so it's not as if there is a native hostility to the role of religion in political leadership in the country. It's just that it has been very deeply privatized. Annemie Paul raised it herself as an important point in talking about her character, who she was, what shaped her, right? And so she took the initiative on that. I don't think the media reacts to things more often than it creates them. And certainly in the case of Andrew Scheer, you're quite right. But I don't have a problem with, I don't share Andrew Scheer's conservative theology by any means, and I don't share his politics either, for that matter. But I didn't think it was a problem that it would surface. It seems to me far better for people to know these things about people who are running for office, to know something about why they hold the views that they hold. It's not a way of censoring them. It's not a way of reprimanding them. It's not a way of determining whether they're votable or not. It's a way of saying, well, this is who you are. This is what made you. Are you open to change? How are you going to represent your constituents who may not hold these views, right? What's the makeup of your philosophical view of life, right? If we want to put it, everybody seems to get really frightened when we talk about a theological view. So we soften and say, oh, your philosophical view, whatever, it seems to me it would be helpful to know that view. When you look at the United States, you have various things going on in the religion political division. But I mean, we knew that George H.W. Bush was a devout Episcopalian. We knew that George W. Bush was United Methodist, but that was kind of a political conversion. But nonetheless, he took it seriously enough. And we know Trump's roots are Presbyterian, but that he has absolutely no understanding of Christian theology or faith of any dimension. Very interesting that the most disruptive force is actually the least religious, who nonetheless manages to exploit the more credulous religious community in the American electorate by aligning himself with right-wing and particularly narrowly defined evangelical causes. And I mean narrowly defined because there are several evangelicals who wouldn't subscribe to that, but he appeals to a specific religious market without any understanding of religion and without any obvious faith life, in sharp contrast to many who went before him in the presidential office. So it's very interesting, but again, they're interested in that. They talk about it. It's on the news. Commentators refer to it. Pundits bring it up. Rarely does it happen, though I take your point on this, Deirdre. It probably happened more in the recent election than it has in any election we've had in the last few decades. So maybe this is a trend that's going to lead to some kind of recovery. But thank you for that. Well done.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
So we have a couple of people that would like me to pose questions on their behalf.
Oh, sure.
So the first, there was actually two questions about. Well, the first question is, can you speak a little bit about the Indigenous situation in Canada and the Church?
Yes, I can. Again, I'm engaged in frightful self-promotion here, but I've got to go down that route. I've written extensively about it, actually, called Après Kamloops le Deluge, After Kamloops the Flood. You can access it by going on the presidential blog of St. Mark's College Corpus Christi. It's called Pontifex Minimus, is my blog, meaning small bridge builder, as opposed to the Pontifex Maximus, who's in Rome, who's the big bridge builder. And so I write this weekly column that's a reflection on ecclesial life. And I wrote extensively. It's a very long document. It's 44 pages. And we divided it up over 3 weeks because it's not really a blog. But you can access that that full document of life. And it's my effort to respond to the crisis, because I had the extraordinary bad luck to be appointed the president of a college, not only during a pandemic, but in the province where this whole crisis erupted with fury this year. And we have one of our nominees for an honorary doctorate, Bishop Fergus O'Grady. There was a push in the public media for the revocation of an honorary degree that was given by the University of British Columbia, not St. Mark's, to the bishop in 1986, I believe. The bishop died in 1998. And he had been, in the late 40s, early 1950s, he had been the principal of the Kamloops Indian Residential School. There is absolutely no evidence whatsoever that he was abusive or insensitive. Quite the contrary. When he became Bishop of Prince George, he set about to establish a number of schools that would allow Native children to be able to go home for lunch and not live in residence, and began to set in place an alternative educational model. Many people consider him a quite heroic figure, but any association with any residential school, particularly in capacity as a leader, is difficult in this time. And as I think you can appreciate the collateral damage. So because of all the things that are going on in British Columbia, and because the Catholic Church in British Columbia is to some degree implicated, we had many residential schools there, and religious orders ran them on behalf of the government and also on behalf of the church. And because many of the Indigenous communities in British Columbia are amongst the most articulate and politically active in this country, just extraordinary leadership. The current chancellor of the University of British Columbia, Stephen LaPointe, is a native, is a Indigenous person, and also received an honorary degree from St. Mark's. Is a member of the judiciary, just an extraordinary person, and you find leadership like this throughout the province. So when the situation erupted, it took on a particular high-level drama, rightly so, that has rippled right across the country and really unsettled the Canadian moral conscience, and especially of the church. So given that, I've had to write about it in the Globe and Mail. I've had to write about it for Commonweal magazine, an article, fairly lengthy article they put up during the summer on their website called The Wrong Men. And then this lengthy analysis that appears on our blog, in which I try to show that using a different hermeneutical lens, it is possible to draw on the Catholic intellectual and spiritual tradition and have taken a different path. And I use Thomas Merton, a figure I'm quite familiar with. I've written 4 books on the guy, and John Moriarty, an extraordinary Irish visionary who had worked with, got to know many Indigenous people in Saskatchewan and Manitoba when he was a professor at the University of Manitoba in the late 60s. Up to 1971, I think, before he returned to Ireland. So I talk about using a way of interpreting the crisis we're facing right now by showing that there had been an alternative way of doing these things by simply respecting the difference that is the other. rather than respecting the other by eliminating difference, and showing alternative Catholic critiques of the conquest of the Americas. I mean, we all know the story of Bartolomeo de las Casas, Montesino, Vittorio Montesino. We know also of efforts within various sectors. We know about Pope Alexander VI, discovery doctrine, but people forget Paul III, Pope Paul III's encyclical or decree, really calling for the full recognition of the freedom and the rights of the native peoples of the Americas to be respected by the conquistadores. We know which side was taken. They followed Alexander, they didn't follow Pope Paul III. But that's also our Catholic history. And to know something about Catholic history is to know that there have always been alternatives. There's always the path that's not taken. So I spent some time writing this up. You can access it. It is free. There's no charge. You can distribute it, do what you like. I was quite nervous about it because I'm very concerned about the appropriation of voice. Who am I to insert myself into this debate? I was delighted to hear from a very prominent Canadian Indigenous woman, professor of Indigenous Studies and former chairperson of the Canadian Writers Union, that she agreed entirely. So that's a form of validation for me. It's a form of confirmation I didn't get it entirely wrong. But I have written about the crisis, as I say, in the Globe and Mail, in Commonweal, and most extensively on the presidential blog. And you're more than welcome to access any of this information you can. And you can do so, again, free of charge by just going on the websites of Commonweal and the Globe and Mail.
Another comment posted to be read. First comment was wonderful talk, very enlightening. I myself left the church with much grief about 5 years ago. You mentioned the pedophilia scandals, and we've just discussed the residential school revelations. How, in the face of such constant proof of toxic culture of Catholicism, do you maintain and nourish your own hope?
You know, that's an anguished question, and it's a question that's in the heart of a very large number of Roman Catholics. A few years ago, before the revelations around the residential school discoveries, and we've known this, by the way, for a long time. I think we all appreciate that. We can see that in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report. I was asked by Michael Enright of CBC fame on Sunday edition, and full disclosure, Michael and I are personal friends, and we share a history going back to St. Michael's College School. He asked me, how do I remain in the church? And this was long after I'd written a book about the sexual abuse crisis, but it surfaced again. And I said, well, first of all, my faith is grounded in the carpenter's son. I think, you know, if you put your faith in the structures of the church, you're going to be in a serious problem, because if you look at the history of the church, it's a history of pathology. It's also a history of holiness. But you always have to keep those in balance, right? You always have to say, all right, so we have leadership that's gone rotten, or we have lay Catholics who have besmirched the reputation of the church. The primary concern about maintaining the reputation of the church, which has been a dominant concern, and is a dominant concern of any institution, any brand, any manufacturing company, any commercial enterprise, any government, is always concerned about maintaining its brand, the purity of its brand, cleaning up. They have whole key teams of people involved with damage control, right? Spin doctors and all this kind of thing. It's a nasty business, but it's the reality. We shouldn't engage in these things, and we have done so to great peril, right? We should acknowledge the pathologies, the weakness, the woundedness. We're a forgiving church. And as Pope Francis has reminded us, we're a field hospital, all right? We're not the perfect society. We're a field hospital. And as a consequence, the weakness within the church, the weakness within its leadership, and not just its leadership, but within the church as a whole, of course, it is demonstrative or illustrative of the life of the wounded and the broken. But when these structures enable the perpetuation of evil, that's when we come to a crisis point. And that's where people lose their faith in the structures. And they feel they're also losing their faith, period. They may not be losing their faith. They may be losing hope in the capacity of the church to reform itself, but they're not really losing their faith. So I like to make that important distinction. It's one of the strong reasons why, when people often ask me questions, Catholics and non-Catholics, because there's still enormous interest in the Catholic Church, not just in its dysfunction, scandals, and everything else, which really alienates Catholics within their own church, but there is still a tremendous interest in what does the Catholic Church offer in a time of universal dissolution, with the Pope talking about our earth as a common home, when we have writers and thinkers and mystics and activists who speak to the particular genius of Catholic life, but aren't corrupted by its structures. Well, that's the counterbalance, right? And how do you become acquainted with that? But through the reading, through the material. That's why I lamented the absence of Catholic organs of opinion, the disseminating structures of shared communication, controversial opinion, contested argument. Where are they? We still have, rarefied theological journals and whatnot read by, 2.1 person per article. This is essential. It's part of the scholarly apparatus. It's the thing we do. I've done it. It's important, but it's not as important as we tend to think. What is more important is the communication of knowledge, its general appropriation by the community at large, not by dumbing down, but by elevating up, by allowing people to enter into a deeper conversation. So how do you do that within the Catholic world? We actually have a significant diminishment of that presence by several of these organs of dissemination and public inquiry disappearing. At the same time, the larger media has become increasingly indifferent, only energized when there is a crisis or a scandal to cover. So I think for ordinary Catholics, one of the ways of retaining, there are two ways of retaining one's balance or spiritual equilibrium in a time in which everything is a whirligig. And you can find a still point in the whirligig of life, right? For many people who continue to inspire me personally within the Catholic Church are people, ordinary people of prayer. There are people who are grounded. They're grounded in their relationship with Jesus. They're grounded in their relationship with the ecclesial life of the church. That they don't, because they entertain no naivete. They understand the pathologies of the weaknesses. Well, they don't justify them. They understand them, right? And they realize the deeper reality that is Catholic communion, and they work with that. They build solidarity, they build communities around themselves. You're going to see more and more of this, I think, because the Catholic Church will begin to disengage, it will begin to fracture in various seams. We can already see it. It doesn't mean we're going into schism. It means you're going to be Catholic in different ways. Now, it sounds horrifying for some, but it's not so horrifying. I mean, the issues that face a practicing Catholic in Ghana are different than those facing a practicing Catholic in Krakow or in Prague or in downtown Toronto. There are different issues, a common faith, but different issues. How does one react to these, right? But you build communion within community. Okay, community within a larger community. It's kind of a Joe Clark iteration, I know, but it's not really a red Tory argument I'm making here, though there's much to be said for that. But it is an argument that we are a communitarian church. Communion really matters. And it's a communion with the living and the dead, with the broken as well as with the healed, with the saintly as well as with the sinner. Maintaining that equilibrium of tensions is key. So a prayer life that allows us to have a still point of the whirligig of both ecclesial and larger political dissolution is key. Another important factor is just simply to know the history of the church. If many Catholics knew the history of their church, they wouldn't be nearly as dispirited or as despondent as they are now, because they will look at a history of perfidy, infamy, brokenness, as well as a history of heroism, holiness, and witness. So I always encourage Catholics, get to know your history. Very often, the only history they know is the history of the now. They think the Sisters of St. Joseph, for instance, or the Congregation of St. Basil, both 19th century post-French Revolution foundations, were around at the time of Jesus, that Jesus had the Sisters of St. Joseph with him, or the Jesuits. I mean, the Jesuits have only been around since the 16th century. So we have a history of cycles, renewal, change, disappearance. Things die, orders die, congregations die, new ways of being monks emerge, old ways disappear. People will often say, well, you know, there's the firmness or the solidity of certain Catholic structures have been with us forever. No, they haven't. No, they haven't at all. If you look at the history of monasticism, you look at a history of renewal, purgation. So the Benedictines come out of the Desert Fathers, and they're doing really great. And then they become the establishment and the major landowners. And then you have the corruption of Cluny. And then you have the reform of the Benedictines. And then you have the Cistercians. And then the Cistercians take over from the Benedictines and try to recover the primitive rule of living life in poverty, chastity, and obedience. And then eventually they become the big landowners, the agribusiness of their day, whatnot, and they have to be reformed. And in the 17th century, the French Aumont-de-Rance reforms them in a place called La Trappe, and then you have the Trappe. So the Cistercians of the strict observance happened with the Carmelites, Teresa of Avila, John of the Cross, reformed the Carmelites. So you get the Discalced Carmelites. In other words, orders, congregations, structures need reform all the time, because we're human, because we atrophy, because we become accustomed or acclimated to the new regime. And we think that's going to be forever. We always do, right? We always do. This is what it's going to be. And in our own lives, my life as a father with 4 children, I thought they'd all become professionals, secure with pensions and everything. They're all in the gig economy. Right? This is how they survive. I don't even know how you survive in a gig economy, because my world, the way I was trained, looking for continuity and surety and everything else, was a different world. It's the same with Catholicism. Things change. They change sometimes utterly, and we don't even recognize the change. So for those who despair of the church and think that you're out of the church, you may not be out of the church at all. You may be on the margins. The things that shaped you and that were formative in your life very often are still there. They may not be institutionalized the way they once were, and you no longer have a love affair with an institution that you feel has betrayed you. But look to its roots, look to its saints, its mystics, its holy women and men. That's the church. That's the heart of the church. Everything else is secondary.
Another question from our modest group. Given the coming synodality process, how would you advise lay Catholics to maximize this opportunity?
But I think every opportunity to participate is one of them, even though you know that may be small. We're having the same issue with the Archdiocese of Vancouver. The Vancouver people are doing their thing, and they've asked St. Mark's and Corpus Christi to do ours. Well, I talked to our new director of the Center for Christian Engagement, John Martins, and I said to him, meet with the Chancery and figure out what is the best way in which we can make a contribution. And so what we're going to do is we're going to have a day or two in which we will bring the faculty, the staff, and the students of Corpus Christi and St. Mark's, and hopefully also our parish, St. Mark's Parish, which is a Jesuit parish right on our campus, and say, okay, let's come together and let's talk about these things, and then collate the information, provide the information for the Chancery. The Chancery will in turn do what it needs to do in order to send to the appropriate synodal office in Rome. Now, we all know that our voice will be a small one, right? We're just a small section of this larger choir. And that's going to be true right across the world. And there are various dioceses that are taking this with enormous energy. Southwark, Limerick, Dublin. And then there are other dioceses that just wish it would go away. They'll do the minimal. They're not committed to the Pope's vision of synodality. They just wish it would go away. And some of them actually wish he would go away. But he's not going away, and neither is synodality. And then there are other bishops who are embracing it as the future. And so you get the German bishops with the German synod. And I told you earlier about the Archbishop from Luxembourg, right? And Switzerland is now rousing itself in the synodal process, recognizing how important it is in terms of engagement. Would it engage the Catholic community? No, it engaged a fraction of the Catholic community. But that fraction will be the determining point or body for the future of the church and its reform. It always comes from small groups. You know, I mean, I remember many years ago, Gregory Baum giving the Ideas lecture series on CBC, and he talked about the charism of maintenance versus the charism of prophecy. And the charism of maintenance is a responsibility by and large of the magisterium. It is the job to hold things together, preserve the deposit of the faith, if you like, carry us from one generation, one century to another, hold on to the things that we think are important. But very often that role is entirely a conservative, preservative role. That's fine, but it's inadequate. You also need the innovative, creative, and prophetic charism as well. And more often than not in the history of the Catholic Church, that came from the religious orders. Where do you think these orders came from? Why did they come into existence? To respond to a crisis. The Jesuits responded to a crisis. The Sisters of St. Joseph and the Congregation of St. Basil responded to a crisis after the revolutions of 1789 and later, 1848, well, 1830 as well, and 1848 in France. They all come out of a situation of upheaval and crisis and breakdown. And they look, okay, where are we going to go in the future? Like, how are we going to articulate this? How are we going to find new structures to respond to new needs? Well, that's where we are right now. We're in a time of institutional breakdown. We're trying to find our way forward. And that's why we need to listen to new voices. And we need to recognize that when something new comes to birth, it doesn't mean that what preceded it is deplorable or to be despised, or to be seen simply as an anachronism. No. Very often what happened in the past, institutions and structures rose, dealt with those issues, but now they've lost their charism. They don't know what they should do anymore. They don't know what's an issue now that they can identify with, and they can't draw the numbers. Okay, they can't get what we used to call the vocations. Well, it's important to say, okay, where do we go now? Cardinal Carter once said to me, when he and Doug Letson and I were writing his biography, he said, you know, the first, and he was doing a kind of redaction of some earlier larger critiques by various ecclesiastical historians, but he was making it his own. He said the first millennium was the millennium of the monks, was the emergence of the monastic fathers out of the desert fathers and desert mothers and their witness, right? People often forget, along with St. Benedict was his sister, St. Scholastica. Similarly, with St. Francis, we have St. Clare. And of course, we have the great Hildegard of Bingen. We have all kinds of things going on. And the second millennium, he said, the second millennium will be the millennium of the religious orders. That's when they came and achieved their fruition, met their purpose. He said the third millennium will be the age of the laity. Well, it's a little glib, but it's also true, I think. And an age is not a 24-hour time cycle. It's not breaking news, as I like to say in the news right now. It's not breaking at all. Breaking news is a superficial way of looking at something that's unfolding, takes time, need to know the history, need to know where we're going. That takes days, months. It takes a generation or two. I mean, it was common wisdom by various historians that the wisdom of a council, of a major council, whether it was a church council limited in its provenance and in its mandate, or an ecumenical council, as we saw in the very early centuries of the church, and most especially with the Second Vatican Council, it takes a long time to implement the wisdom and the knowledge of from the council, right? It's not like it's done, there's a press release, everything happens. I mean, look at a Canadian secular equivalent. We have been talking about the importance of writing our relationship with our Indigenous peoples for generations now. We even had the Kelowna Accord, which went nowhere thanks to Prime Minister Harper. But we had all kinds of different things, initiatives, changing the name of departments, doing this. We still move very slowly. and the crisis around the residential schools has forced a new momentum. It's a Kairos moment. It's something you can't suppress. It's like the George Floyd instance in the United States, right? Officers have been killing young Black men for a very long time. But in this particular case, the international imagination was fixed on a particular moment which became symbolic. It was a threshold consciousness moment. You can't go back. Well, if you can't go back on that, we're not going back either on the Indigenous issue. And I think in many ways we're getting to, or we have had threshold moments in the Catholic Church where we say, okay, what we're doing isn't good enough. This we're just not doing it right. And you talk to many bishops in Europe, they're a hell of a lot more savvy about the implications and consequences of a disengaged church than they are in North America, because they're living it. They're on the doorsteps of it. And so they don't have the luxury of saying, well, we'll just hold on to this. Society will change. We'll be back to normal. Won't be long. And the Bourbons will be on the throne again. It's not happening. And the same in Canada. We're in a time of some dissolution. So dissolution calls for new visioning. New visioning also calls for leadership. And leadership comes from several quarters. It comes from those who exercise the role of preservation, the magisterium, communicating the faith, and those who engaged, who implement, who are the laity, and whose responsibility it is to help the church move forward, because we are the church. I mean, often talking about the church as if it is the objective other complicates things from an ecclesiological point of view. Those of us who are baptized, we're the church. And those who are called to specific ordained service or ministry work with us in the church. They don't work above us. They won't work to define us. So it is this new, healthier, I would say, gospel-focused ecclesiology that's going to help us move forward. One final point on this that I can say, and I know I'm taking a very long time answering these questions, and I'm not trying to filibuster, by the way, is the issue of theological literacy. You know, an argument could be made that as I opened these reflections by quoting Monsignor Talbot about hunting and shooting and entertaining. Well, in the majority of cases, the vast majority of cases, lay people would have been theologically illiterate. They wouldn't have been able to sit down to have the kind of conversations Newman was having at Oriel or Trinity College, or in the Brompton Oratory, or at UCD when he founded the university in Dublin. I mean, you know, the theologically literate layperson was an anomaly. But the theological literacy now of lay people is a stunning and powerful factor that really only came into existence starting in the late 1960s. And now in Canada, I don't know the precise statistic right now, so I could be wrong, but up until very recently, the preponderance of students studying in graduate theology, not those in the seminary, but in graduate faculties of theology, were women. This would have been inconceivable, even in the 1960s. As I told you, the first two women graduates was, I think, 1969. Okay, that's a phenomenal change. So the argument that the laity, you know, they really need direction from the clergy because all they can do is hunt, entertain, and shoot. That, of course, would have been true only of aristocratic laity, not the regular Catholic walking downtown Birmingham. The case now is very different. Many lay people are theologically literate, not only theologically literate, but they're credentialed at the highest level as theologians and others in the sacred sciences. The current head of the current head of the Canon Law Society of America is a first Canadian woman, Linda Robitaille, and a mother of several children. That would have been impossible just a decade or two ago. Impossible. Way outside the range of reason. So all kinds of changes are occurring. The number of women working in the Vatican right now is the highest it's ever been. Francis is appointing women to all kinds of positions, even in dicasteries, high-level positions. There was a time when the only women you ever saw in the Vatican were running the cleaning service or deputized to deal with the telephone system. Now they're theologians, they run academies, they work as pro-chancellors, they work in all kinds of capacities. That's changing the tenor and the timbre of the place. Overnight? No. Over several years? Yes. That's how it works. Now, the question that comes up in the age of Twitter and Instagram and Zoom and Facebook, we don't have decades. And that's, again, part of the problem, isn't it? That we don't have the patience for the gestation, the slow creative gestation that's involved with reform. We want it immediately. And that's why you'll often find church leaders in a reactive rather than visionary mode, because they're reacting to something that's just erupted and they don't either have the tools to comprehend it or the skills to articulate a way forward. So they're caught in reactive mode only, right? It is the important role of the lay people to move in where there has been clerical failure. And you'll find that the best clerics and the best bishops will look to the lay people for what they are: partners in the faith, collaborators in the faith, not sheep, and not something, as Richard Simpson said earlier in my quotation, to be feared.
Our next question, Michael, comes from Maggie, and I believe she's unmuting now.
Yes, can you hear me?
I can, Maggie, go ahead.
Thank you. I actually, you said something earlier on that really struck a chord with me that I really want to affirm. And it's, you talked about knowing the history of the church. That's one of the things that we need to do. And I really want to support that because I myself have had experience of that. And it's one of the things that have helped me make it through and remain staunchly Catholic in all of this. It's that I started to really look. When I was 18 years old, somebody challenged me about my church when I was going to leave. I was an Anglican minister, and he said, do you know what you're leaving behind? If you don't know what you're leaving behind, how are you going to be able to move ahead? And so I took the time to really get to know my church and to try and know my church. And I still don't know it in all its entirety. But knowing the history of the church, knowing how we started, looking at where we came from and understanding all the stuff that we've gone through has helped me realize that, you know what we're going through right now is not new. And if the church survived it 2,000 years ago from the days of Paul, if we look at the Gospels, if we look at the letters that Paul wrote, we will see that there was a lot of conflict going on. There might have been different things, and there were many things that were not said. So if things have been going on all this time and the church has survived, then it tells me that there is something in the church that is keeping that survival. And for me, it's the Holy Spirit. We were gifted with the Holy Spirit from the inception of the church. And despite all the frailties that we have, we are making it through. We look at the Jewish faith and all the times that they failed God, and yet God was faithful to them. What it says to me is we are failing God, but he's still faithful to us. And so if we understand our history, we know where we're coming from. We also know where we are, and we know where we are going, because it gives us hope. And it enables me as an individual to stay rooted in the church. The other thing that you said, some other things that I really want to affirm as well. And it's one, you talked about being grounded in our relationship with Jesus and being grounded in the ecclesiastical life of the church. And you said, engage in the dialogue. And those are things that have also kept me going, because one of the ways in which I engaged in the dialogue was to attend a church meeting where we were talking about the sexual abuse of the clergy. And when I heard people share and talk, and I heard the clergy listen, it said to me, there is still hope in our church. There is still something that is worth nurturing. And if the Holy Spirit hasn't given up on us, then we should not give up on ourselves.
Very good. Thank you. I agree with you, Maggie. Any other questions?
Okay, yeah. Our next question is from Paul Tretniak.
We were talking about Paul earlier.
So he'd like to know, can you ask Michael to speak to the changes he sees as essential to the formation of clergy and seminaries, and what role the teaching and practice of the Christian contemplative tradition plays in the renewal of the church?
Okay, two tough questions and two critical ones. I'm of the view, and have been of the view for some time, that we need to demolish the seminaries. I don't see their purpose anymore. They came into existence as reforming structures after the Council of Trent in the 16th century. So they met a need of overwhelming clerical illiteracy, the sin of nihilism, which meant that clerics had mistresses, the abuse of simony, where offices were being bought in the church. There were several abuses. And one of the ways of beginning to address them was to codify the curriculum, if you like, a training, bringing them together, preparing them, men, for future ministry in a way that wasn't ramshackle or lackluster or open to abuse. And so, especially again, created by a crisis, right? It was the crisis of the reform, created the seminaries. Well, they've served a purpose over several centuries, though in many ways they have contributed more than any other structure to maintaining a culture of clericalism, obviously, because that's the womb in which clerics are shaped. And it's out of the seminary structure that you develop a sense of entitlement. Some even talk about their ontological exceptionality, which is just nonsense, of course, and builds up a whole culture of deference and expectation of respect. And the Catholic laity contributed enormously to reinforcing that. But in our time, it just is inadequate. It seems to be on several fronts. One, it isn't a proper place to educate people to psychosexual maturity. It's a gender-specific environment that reaffirms particular values around masculinist superiority. It's a safe environment to get out of it. I remember a couple of rectors saying to me, and one bishop saying to me, the biggest crisis they have are with priests back out, young priests back out working in the community, the survival rate after 5 years. Well, that may be true of some jurisdictions and not true of others, I don't know. But what I do know is this, that the future of a reformed presbyterate is probably best discovered in the French movement that we had during the Second World War, actually, called the priest worker movement. And the priest worker movement, briefly put, has the priest living with lay people in tenements and in apartments and whatever, pension, whatever, working at the Renault factory, working as a consulting psychiatrist, working in various capacities. In other words, they had a day job. And their role as sacramental ministers wasn't diminished by that, but enhanced by it because they were closer to the people. And so they would celebrate the Eucharist, and they would celebrate and distribute the sacraments. They would engage in their priestly ministry at the same time as they worked alongside the lay people in other capacities as professionals. I think this is the only way to move forward. It's the only way in the current structure in which young men and well, not just young men, because there are many going in who are older, can appreciate the complexity of life working with in a lay dominant society in ways that don't exclude them, and in ways that remind them that they are ministers of the word, that they are ministers of the sacrament, and that they are servants, not local potentates, which the seminary structure encourages. It's also a breeding ground for future bishops, because very often rectors and spiritual directors in seminaries are appointed as bishops. So I don't see the point of the seminary, frankly. I mean, for some, this may seem like a kind of a radical option. I don't think it is. I think when an institution has served its purpose, when it's become spiritually and intellectually atrophied, it's time to move on. It's got time to come up with different structures. Now, that raises the whole question of the reform of the presbyterate itself, the role of women in the diaconate, the role of women in the ministerial priesthood. What do these mean? What are the prospects? What's the horizon? I'm one of these people who believes that we need to reform the presbyteral structures before we invite women into full ministry. I don't see any immediate value in ordaining women in a structure that is necessary for reform. My experience, and again, it's limited to my experience, people may have alternate ways of talking about it. My experience with several women who have left Catholic life and have become Anglican priests are more clerical than most of the male clerics I know, because they've taken on or appropriated many of the qualities, distinctive features that they see important within a power structure that seems to me to be atrophying. So I think we need to think about some new structures. We need to think about new ways in which we educate to ministry, ways in which we make discernment about who are to be our priests, ways of thinking seriously, radically, and openly about the possibilities of women in sacerdotal ministries or in decanal ministries. I mean, what are the arguments for and against talking really now, talking theologically and biblically, talking culturally, not talking in terms of preserving power or accessing power or human rights, but talking about this as a legitimate, if it is, spirit-infused evolution in Christian life. Those conversations can't happen, or that progress can't be made, unless there is a full candor about the issue itself and the arguments for either opening the presbyterate to the ordination of women or keeping it forever closed because it was God's will. Well, you know, we really need to have a conversation grounded in the fundamentals of the Christian understanding around this, rather than those that are driven by spurious fears or the retention of arguments that are unpersuasive even to those who are articulating them, but also not reducing it to a rights issue where people say, I have a right to do this, I have a right to do that. And it's just simply a matter of politicizing the ministry. That's not the route to go either. So I think we're at a point where we need to think, pray, discern, and be patient as the universal church discusses this. I actually agree with Cardinal Czerny and Pope Francis in this matter. I don't think we foreclosed discussion around it. I don't think the Pope is attempting to do this, and these issues are going to arise in the Synod regardless. But what I think is we have to realize that it is a universal church. And as a universal church, because these are fundamental matters of doctrine, not of practice. I talked earlier about the church in Ghana being different than the church in Canada. Well, that's true. But on certain specific doctrinal matters, we're a church in unity, right? And so we can't engage in the kind of diversity that you find in the Anglican Commonwealth. That's a very different ecclesial model in some respects. It's not the Roman model. And so it seems to me that we're in for the long haul on this, right? And so how do you get to the next stage if you can't have that full frankness about what are the issues at stake? And very importantly to me, the current seminary structure merely perpetuates an increasingly archaic understanding of the priesthood and doesn't serve either the minister or the parish in the end. So the reform needs to be a quite radical one, root and branch, if you like. With regard to the contemplative tradition, the contemplative tradition has always been a very deep one that runs through like a leitmotif in Catholic life and spirituality. And I think in recent years, many lay people, thanks to the work of people like John Main, Thomas Merton, of course, Basil Pennington, Thomas Keating, oh heavens, the former prioress of Mount St. Benedict, Joan Chittister, and many others, Wendy Beckett, many others have brought the contemplative tradition out of the cloister, out of the textbook, out of the sanctuary, into the life of the kitchen. There's a wonderful book by Margaret Hebethwaite in which she talks about doing the spiritual exercises, the annotation 19, at the same time that she's involved with nappies because she had 3 children. And these kind of things seem to me to not only enrich our spiritual lives and reflect again the plenitude of the tradition, but also provides an invitation to do what we were talking about earlier, Paul, and that is to continually to reform the tradition. Now, I think it's 1 minute over 4 o'clock. I'm a keener for stopping when we're supposed to stop. So can we wrap it up now?
I think we can go ahead and wrap it up. I just had one last question. Would you take one more question?
Ordinarily, I wouldn't, but because you're a nice person, I will.
All right. The next question is actually from Beverly, so we'll turn it over to Beverly.
Hi, everyone. This is a big question, so you don't have to answer it really, but I would just open the thought. And when you were talking about the Mount Cashel crisis and all the other sexual abuse crises that the church has been facing, and then Pope Francis's comment to the Sauvé report about looking truth in the face, you also mentioned that we're still really wrestling with root causes. If you have one thought about what a root cause might be, what would that be? What are you thinking?
Well, that's a very good question, and I will answer it, Ben, because it's an important one to answer. I don't think there's one absolute root cause. I think there are many root causes, and they coalesce around privileging of the masculine and the clerical. But you know, the crisis around sex abuse in the end isn't per se the crisis around what is now called pedocriminality, meaning pedophilia, clerical pedophilia, which is the dominant abuse. Okay, and in the church in France, it's less than 5%, but it still resulted in something like 214,000 cases of abuse, because predators any individual predator could have hundreds, if not thousands, of people that he's abused during his time, right? There are always people who suffer from serious sexual dysfunction. And pedophilia and ebophilia are particularly difficult, number one, to identify, because very often these are charismatic individuals. We know the type. The type is not usually somebody sitting in the back of a cinema waiting to pounce on a kid. It's usually somebody who inserts himself comfortably in a public forum, wins the confidence of parents, exercises a certain charismatic charm, and builds and cultivates and lures, and then preys on. The difficulty is because you can find them in the military, you find them in media, you find them in sports, you find them in scouts, for heaven's sakes. Look at the situation of Boy Scouts in the United States right now. So we have many examples of how this is done, particularly in exclusively male power-focused environments. And certainly the clergy is an excellent example of this. The crisis in the clergy is not that in and of itself it's anomalous. The crisis in the church was the cover-up, the failure to accept responsibility, the failure to privilege the victim over the reputation of the church, the failure to respond to the gospel as the primary imperative rather than the law office, the failure to realize that repair will require humility of the church rather than being obsessed about vicarious liability. So the failure was a failure of leadership, prioritization, the recognition that we are a failed church, and how do we deal with the victims, but by ways of, first of all, acknowledging and listening to their pain and beginning the process of full public repair. We didn't do that. And we're still facing the consequences of not having done that at critical times. Right. So it is we have the same issue that's arisen over the residential schools, although that's not primarily sex abuse. There is a dimension of that too, of course, in the residential schools. It's the failure of accountability. It's failure of oversight. is the failure of, and the Pope, I mean, this is not me saying this, Hans Zollner says it in the Vatican. Popes have said this, Francis particularly. I'll end on this because I think it's a rather hopeful note. I have been told by several people very close to the Pope who have told me that when he meets with the representatives of the Inuit and the Métis and First Nations, some of whom will raise the issue of sex abuse, obviously, cultural abuse, physical abuse, all the kinds of things that have become the sad reality of the residential schools. I've been told that when the Pope is with them, he will not only listen to their pain, but he will enter into their pain, that he's masterful at this because they sense his pastoral authenticity. They will get from him, I think, what they've been yearning to get from others. I had one Globe and Mail reporter talking to me at one point, and she said, you know, the most dispiriting thing of my research, investigative research, was not the fact that these things have happened, but that the people I was speaking with didn't seem to convey any compassion in their voice or their response. This was a problem to be reckoned with or a problem to avoid rather than an issue to be addressed. So it does seem to me, again, how people are shaped and formed will determine their ministry. I can think of two. Well, I can think of more than two, actually. I can think of about four right at the top of my head of people who have most inspired me in my life are diocesan celibate priests whose authenticity in their ministry continues to this day because they are comfortable in their skin. And they're comfortable in their skin because they know they are servant ministers. I remember when I was working on the second book of Henry Nouwen, he commented in a letter that he wrote to somebody that he really enjoyed his seminary life. You know, he made friends, he learned a lot, but he said there were two things that he didn't learn, and they were the two most important things if he was ever going to be an effective minister, and they had to learn them afterwards. One was how to pray, and the other one was how to be intimate. And he didn't mean intimate erotically. He meant intimate in that he was comfortable emotionally with women and men. He could be with them. He could share with them. He could be himself with them. He didn't have to perform to a certain persona, an artificial image that he had to construct. He could be himself for whatever that is, or whatever that is. That seems to me true. If that's true of Henry Nouwen's experience in the seminary, and that was very typical of the 1950s, I don't think it's that different from now, frankly. In fact, if anything, those going into the seminary now are much more conservative than those that entered the seminary either immediately after the council or in the years immediately following the council. And there are various historical, cultural, and psychological reasons for that, but that will take us into another 2 hours, 2 hour talk. So I'm going to wrap it up now, but thanks for the question, Bev. It's a very good one.
Okay, and at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Ken Sherman. We'll just need you to unmute.
Okay.
There we go.
I'm so proud to have been here today to have enjoyed this presentation, for being helped to look truth in the face, inspiring Michael, to hear you tell your personal story in such an entertaining and intellectual way, for calling us together to walk the synodical way to kickstart this process, as the process has begun in the last 2 weeks. I'm so thankful to your presence with us and wish you well in your ministry. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Ken. It's wonderful work that this group is doing, and I consider myself part of this group too.
Thank you so much, Michael. I just want to thank everyone who joined today and everyone who's hung in there. I know we went a bit over time, but we do appreciate your presence. I just want to remind you before we sign off that there are other speakers in the series. And I also want to invite you please to go on the website and sign up. These are excellent speakers and excellent resources to us as we at CLC really work to look truth in the face and to embody that third millennial vision of Cardinal Carter. I didn't know he said the third millennium would belong to the laity, Michael, but I'm very happy that he did. And I think that we are part of that. So I also want to point out, not on the slide, but our colleagues, our St. Catherine's Diocese chapter, the Niagara Haldeman CLC group are sponsoring an event on November 2nd. It's also available on our website. You can get information there, but it's really about how we can contribute to the healing of sexual abuse. So please consider attending that on November 2nd. Thanks, everyone. And please stay connected. If you haven't subscribed to our website yet, please sign on so that we can send you news about events and information that's coming from our church. Thanks, everyone.
Bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye
Thanks,
now.
everybody.